All right, welcome everyone. We're thrilled to have you here with us today for our talk entitled The History of Still Life Painting in the 17th Century. Before we begin, a few quick housekeeping notes. Please remain muted during the talk so that everyone can enjoy the presentation without distractions. We'll have a Q&A session at the end, so feel free to jot down any questions you have in the chat or just save them till the talk wraps up. Um, just a reminder that we stream this on our Facebook page live, so you can revisit it later or you can share it with any who may be interested. Our speaker today is Timken docent Karen Harmelson. So without further delay, I'll turn the virtual floor over to Karen, and thank you, Karen, and enjoy the talk.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Welcome everybody to one of my favorite presentations because I've always been a huge fan of still life painting. And you might say, well, on the hierarchy of painting, it's not a history painting, it's not a religious painting, it's not a mythological painting. But the reason why it really speaks to me is because you really learn about the people and the culture by the objects they collect, the symbolism they attribute to each object, and what was sort of their passions. And so here we're looking actually at a German still life painter, George Flegel, and it's one of the most beautiful throughout the presentation. I think you'll really be impressed by his work. But let me spend a few minutes just talking about the nature of still life painting, sort of its history. Still life painting was documented in ancient Egypt. It was shown in wall paintings in Rome and Greece. So it is early in antiquity, they did create still life paintings. In the Middle Ages, still lifes began to appear in paintings of religious significance and also among illuminated manuscripts, because illuminated manuscripts were highly detailed with fruits and flowers and vegetables. And so that kind of allowed some of these painters to get a training in this kind of object and depiction of this kind of object. So we do see them in the Middle Ages. Now, if you look at the Portinari altarpiece by Hugo van der Goes, and that was from about 1480, a Flemish painter, you will see in his altarpiece in the foreground in front of Mary a beautiful still life. So you can see how these artists began to incorporate aspects of still life in their paintings and then eventually try to create an individual still life. So, what countries are we going to be looking at? Yes, in France, we had later in the 17th century, we had Chardin, for example, a marvelous still life painter. But the countries that really produced the most still life paintings were today's Holland, Belgium, and Spain and Italy. So those four countries will be the focus of this talk. I will be including the work of George Flegel, who is German, and Albrecht Dürer, but they also had involvement with Dutch and Flemish and Italian. So they sort of cross-pollinated. There are different kinds of still life painting, and before we start to look at them, I just want to give you a little idea. There are what we call vanitas, and vanitas paintings show the brevity of life. They're moralizing because the Dutch and Flemish gave a lot of credibility to objects and how they could evoke symbolism. So, for example, you put a skull, that's a pretty obvious memento mori, or momentum of death. Some objects were incorporated in these paintings and had a little more um, subtle definition, for example, like a lemon. You might say, well, how does a lemon have symbolic reference? Well, it referenced exotic travel, reference wealth. Okay. What is a parrot reference? A parrot references also wealth and the exotic nature of travel that the Dutch were doing. Pronkstilleven were the kinds of still life you're looking at here, which is an elaborate painting with foodstuffs and exotic flowers and objects. So that's called Pronkstilleven. So we had the vanitas, which were moralizing with memento mori, which we will show you down the line. We had just the regular stilleven, still life. The Dutch named that in the 17th century. And that would just be a still life without the elaborate qualities that you're going to be seeing in some of these paintings. The Spanish practiced bodegones, and they were scenes oftentimes incorporating fruits and vegetables, but they were like market scenes in interiors. And then we had suspended nature. And that was more of what the Italians did when we look at the work of
I'm
Caravaggio.
sorry, your slides aren't changing. All I am seeing is your first slide.
That's actually I'm intending to do that. I do usually like to do about 5 minutes of just a general overview. And then what I'm going to do is I will reintroduce that information in a couple minutes when I show you each slide. I hope that's okay. So, for example, I like to do a little bit of an introduction before I show you all the images because there's so much detail in each image. I try to just kind of do a little overview. So, you will be seeing slides in about 2 minutes, okay? Just bear with me if you could. Um, so, a couple other things I wanted to talk about before we start the slide presentation is the idea of light. So, light is very important in these still lifes, and you see basically two light forms, and that is chiaroscuro, which the Dutch practice in Flemish, and then we actually have tenebrism, which is what the Spanish practice. And I think, as the viewer suggests, that perhaps when I go through some of these, you will get a better understanding. So why don't we just go ahead and start that? And here we are, sort of the genesis of still life painting was probably the empirical observations of Albrecht Dürer. So Albrecht Dürer was an absolute genius. I mean, he was a painter, an engraver, a printmaker, a writer, a traveler. He really brought Renaissance ideas to North and South. So he was really the genesis of how the North and the South began to trade ideas during the time of the Renaissance. Why am I showing you a Renaissance painting? Because it's very helpful, I think, sometimes to look before to what was sort of the birth of these still life paintings. So this was done in the Renaissance, the Northern Renaissance, by the great Albrecht Dürer, who, as you might know, was born in Nuremberg, Germany. Now, Nuremberg was a great city at that time. His father was a goldsmith. They made a lot of money, but also it's where the Martin Luther put the 95 edicts on the Catholic Church door to begin the Protestant Reformation. So Dürer was very involved with the Protestant Reformation, that is part of his history. But so he did all these wonderful woodcuts and engravings, and he traveled a lot. I mean, he knew the work of Leonardo. Leonardo knew his work. He knew the work of the great Bellini brothers because he went twice to Venice to study with them. And he brought many of these great ideas. So let's look at this emerging idea of still life. Here we have a tuft of grass and with cowslips. So cowslips are little yellow wildflowers. And what he probably do to create this still life is, now you might say, well, it's not exactly a still life. It's more like a botanical drawing. But you have to understand too that botanical drawings were also very important to the development of still life painting. So look at all the detail. It is said that he went to the ground, scooped up this marvelous little intact still life, and he placed it in his studio and sketched it. Well, this is actually gouache, so it's almost like a watercolor. But look at the details. Look at this observation. So people looked at the great Albrecht Dürer and obviously were inspired by his love of nature. Now, what these artists were doing is they were very interested not only in the natural world, because remember, science is blooming in the 17th century. We have von Leeuwenhoek, who invents the microscope, for example. In 1609, Galileo aims his telescope at the celestial sky. So science is really evolving. And people were aware of new types of objects that were brought in with science, like sorry, with the botanical drawings, new ideas about botany, new ideas about science and observation and light. So Caravaggio, who was probably the most revolutionary artist of his time, he really changes about 200 years of art creation by his ideas. He believed in using real people, real ideas. So in his paintings, you might find a local person just put in a religious painting, for example. These fruits that you're looking at are rather affected by different blights. So it isn't a perfect still life. He really paints from reality. But what is probably the significant aspect of Caravaggio's contribution is this idea of light. So he perfected the idea of chiaroscuro, how light falls on an object and highlights it. When we get further into the talk, I will show you what tenebrism is, and that's more very dark background with a more white on black kind of, so it just emphasizes each object. But this is more subtle. It brings out dimension. So you get more of a sort of a three-dimensionality with this tenebrism. So Caravaggio loved the work of Michelangelo. He loved the work of Titian and Leonardo, and he incorporated into his marvelous works of art. He people used to think he was from a poor family. He really wasn't. He actually came from an upper middle class family. At one time, his family lived in the city of Caravaggio because the plague was going through he was born in Lombardy, and that region was being affected by the plague. So therefore, the family moved to the town of Caravaggio. He did work in Milan before the plague, and then later in Rome, where he died, I believe. He died young, very tragically. So look at the realism in this. What you have is a basket of fruit, and it's a woven basket. What the Italians often did, in particular Caravaggio, is use rather rustic containers. So if you look at the Dutch and Flemish, they use these exquisite Wanley porcelain, gorgeous vases, crystal from blown glass from Venice. But he uses a very simple rustic basket, and we have it perched on a ledge. Now, what we are seeing is summer fruit that's been greatly affected by blight, wormholes. You can probably even see there's like a little caterpillar lurking in here. And so what we see is an oriental, sorry to use that term, I don't think it was used in the past, but you see what's called an oriental fruit moth. Look at this huge hole in the apple. The grapes look desiccated. These have nice light source here, this chiaroscuro here. The leaves are browning and dying. You even have sort of a disembodied cluster of leaves. But what is he saying with all this egg larvae and moth-eaten fruit? Only a few pieces are actually intact right here, and these two figs. Why? What is he trying to convey? Okay, so remember I said in the beginning that objects to many of these 17th century painters carried symbolic messages. So what is he commenting on? Well, of course, the brevity of life was always part of these still lives. Fading beauty. He was a handsome man and a great romantic, it was said, and he realized, this idea of fading beauty, the ephemeral nature of life. But more importantly, he was also commenting on what he considered the rot of the Catholic Church. So you can look at this basket and say, oh, summer fruit that's been affected, but it's also has pretty heavy symbolism. Now, let's go to the next work by Caravaggio, and it's called Still Life with Fruit. This is a masterpiece of still life painting. Look, it's very early at the very beginning of the Baroque, and it's so infused with light and warmth and beautiful tonalities. The light source has a funny story. So Caravaggio was kind of an independent thinker, and he was experimenting with light at such a degree. And one day in his rented studio, he decided that he needed a more direct light source on these objects that he was depicting. So it was said that he carved a hole in the roof so that beautiful beam of light that suffuses the painting with all these warm tones. That was his kind of invention. I'm going to find a way. Now, look at all these. These are marrow, which is a type of squash. We have intact fruit. We open pomegranates, figs, very sensual, very erotic, actually. I mean, look at these forms. pretty erotic if you think about it. And then he opens up the watermelon. So you see this luscious, sort of almost look like melting melon and fruit. But the warm tonalities on this beautiful ledge, again, he's using a more rustic ledge. This isn't a beautiful carpeted tabletop, but suffice to say, it is a beautiful Roman still life. So we're going to leave Italy for a little bit. We are going to go back to a couple Italian painters. One thing I also want to mention, I am going to include women painters because so sadly, prior to this, we weren't seeing a lot of women painters. Not that they weren't painting, but they were relegated to doing certain types of painting like portraiture. But still life was a great genre for many female painters, and so we're going to be looking at them. But first, we're going to look at the great Ambrosius Bosschaert. And he was a Protestant. He was one of the pioneers of Dutch painting. Now, because of the Protestant Reformation and what was happening through the 16th and parts of the 17th century, a lot of these artists, if they were Flemish Protestant, they were moving back into Holland. If they were Dutch, they might be moving back to Antwerp, because remember, the area which is today Holland, it was Protestant, became Protestant, particularly after about 1607, and the Flemish retained their Catholic religion. So many of these artists, because of their religious beliefs, sometimes had to move around, but they also had that opportunity to learn from other artists. So we'll go back to this artist, and he was a pioneer, as I mentioned. He was born in Antwerp in the late part of the 16th century. His father, too, was a famous artist, Ambrosius Bosschaert, the first and the second. So there was a whole family of artists. He began his career depicting rare plants and flowers from botanical gardens. There was a man named Carlos Clusius, and he was a botanist, and he was developing gardens and studying botany. So some of these artists had the privilege of going to his gardens and really studying carefully these plants. Where did he develop the garden? In Middelburg, what would be today Holland. So this artist moved into Holland for a time, and then he worked with some of the Dutch still life painters. He was also an art dealer, and he really helped develop the idea of still life painting. So let's look at this beautiful Stilleven, this still life. And you have so many different flowers, carnations, tulips, chrysanthemums, lily of the valley. I am a huge flower fanatic, and that's probably why I've gravitated to still life painting. But one thing you should know, if you like flowers too, these flowers were not all blooming at the same time. Roses and tulips do not bloom at the same time. The Dutch really love tuberous flowers like paper whites and tulips. They love bulb flowers, but they didn't all grow at the same time. So what did they do? They'd sketch them, keep a folio, and then they would incorporate them into one flower arrangement. The other thing I want to mention, the symbolism in these insects, and I will tell you about them in just a moment. But look at this beautiful kind of golden woven basket, a lot more refined than the one we saw with Caravaggio. Tulips. Some of you are familiar with the idea of tulipomania. There's actually a great book about it. And what happened between 1634 and 1637 is the Dutch began to receive tulips that were coming in from the steppes of Russia, which went into the Turkish Ottoman Empire. The sultans loved tulips. In fact, tulip comes from the word turban, and those Turkish sultans really cultivated the tulips, and then it finally found its way into Holland. Because you have to remember, Antwerp in the 16th century, Holland in the 17th century were great economic enclaves. Holland in the 17th century, wonderful maritime culture, beautiful artwork being done, technology, and they were so economically prosperous. They also weren't these big, let's say, aristocrats. They were more modest people, maybe upper bourgeois. So they wanted paintings like this to decorate their homes. No longer do they have to focus on big history paintings, mythological paintings, religious paintings, but they could concentrate on more about the life of the people. And that's what these still lifes convey. So let's look at symbolism. Butterfly. A butterfly is the fleeting nature of life and beauty. Uh, Sometimes these objects had more than one uh, symbol or meaning, but suffice to say, this is quite common about butterflies. Okay, so dragonfly, dynamism, motion, also again, that sort of ephemeral nature. They moved around. Um, and also the bee. Now, bee is more like, I would say, rebirth. So the bee would symbolize rebirth. But the detail on these flowers, it's just absolutely spectacular. Now, a painting that looks a little similar, and I will tell you ahead of time, except for these two, everything is quite different. But I like the fact that you could see how gathering objects in baskets were very popular. So this is Jan Bruegel the Elder. He was called Velvet Bruegel. His father was a very great Pieter Bruegel the Elder, and we actually have a magnificent Bruegel painting in our very own Timken. And so that's actually a religious landscape, Parable of the Sower. But he was known not only for still life, but he did magnificent history paintings. He did incredible depictions of hell. I mean, he was a masterful artist. He could do just about anything. But he loved to paint precious objects. So here we have these precious flowers. So he trained in Brussels. He was born in Bersham, which is on the Dutch-Belgian border. His grandmother was a great artist. His father was a great artist. His brother was a great artist. His children were great artists. So there's a lot of history in this painting. In this family. So he resided in Rome. He worked for some of the cardinals. He worked for the Borromeos, Federico Borromeo. So people loved his work. He traveled to the Netherlands. He actually went to the Netherlands with Peter Paul Rubens, who just loved his work. Okay, so here we have flowers in a basket. And what they've done is they have gathered the flowers from a garden and they will start to arrange them. And perhaps some of you might do that. You go out in your garden and you cut some roses and you put them in a basket and you decide, yes, I think I'll place a few of them in this vase and this vase. So that's exactly what he did. Probably the rarest flower depicted in this painting is this magnificent variegated tulip. Some of these paintings actually had a blight or a fungus, and they prized them because they created such unusual coloration. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, and I apologize I did, but during Tulip Mania, people were spending literally the equivalent of what today would be like $250,000 on tulip futures. So tulips were sort of the first futures market in Europe or in the world. So it's kind of an interesting story. Okay, so we're going to move away from the work of this great artist and go to the next artist, and that is Jacob van Es. And Jacob van Es was a Flemish Baroque painter. He was known for doing more like foodstuffs, objects from the kitchen like we see here rather than flowers. Oh, he did do some flower painting. Peter Paul Rubens loved his work. He worked alongside the great Clara Peters, who we're going to look at, female painter, and Osias Bert. He was very prolific. Typically, he painted things like lobsters and oysters. Because remember, Amsterdam is 10 minutes from the North Sea, and it was a great trading center. So you were getting objects coming in and out. The sea was very important to these people. You also see what we call a Wanli bowl. And so this Wanli bowl, where does it come from? It's from the Ming Dynasty. And they were created then, and the Dutch prized them. In fact, they created their own Delftware based on these ideas from this Ming Dynasty porcelain. And you have two little bowls here, and look how he really creates depth of space. This is a really marvelous quality to this painting. And then, of course, all this beautiful chiaroscuro on the translucent grapes. What does it symbolize here? Well, the cherries or little berries symbolize love and passion. And then we have a lot of yellow fruit. What does yellow fruit symbolize? Sometimes it can say foolishness. And then I said sometimes it could be um, actually fidelity to the one you love. So since he's talking about passion here, we really aren't too sure. But look at the marvelous shading on the fruit, and corn, which was coming from other places, like the Spanish brought it. It was either the Spanish brought it to America or the Americans brought it to Spain. So we're looking at a beautiful tabletop with incredible porcelain. So I would call this still a Stilleven rather than a Pronkstilleven, because the Pronkstilleven were much more elaborate, like what we're going to be looking at right now. So Pronkstilleven was that the Dutch and Flemish used to not only like to moralize about life and how these objects would take on a symbolic reference, but they like to show off. Now, when you look at this painting, and I'm going to fast forward for just a moment because I think it's worth looking at, and then we'll come back. But look how much more minimalist and I would say so austere compared to these Pronkstilleven. So let's go back to this. Okay, so who was Jan Davids de Heem? He was born in Utrecht. He was a Catholic, so he had to move to different regions. He did live in Leiden for a while, but then he moved to Antwerp because of his Catholic status. Why was Leiden so important? Well, Leiden was a university town. That was the birthplace of Rembrandt, for example. So there was a lot of art going on there, but also in Utrecht. Balthasar van der Ast may have been his teacher. We're not quite sure. He loved to paint these Pronkstilleven and vanitas. So the vanitas would be, he painted those earlier, which would be like books and skulls and hourglasses that really talked about the memento mori, the brevity of life, and that we will die. But here we have a little bit more of a, let's say, more uplifting subject matter and much more elaborate. Now, this is desserts. These are a table of desserts, and you can see all manner of sweets. This is sort of a, could be what's called, we have them during the holidays. It's a mince pie. I think it's nut meat. We have all kinds of beautiful fruit. We have a lute, because I told you he liked to paint musical instruments and books, a beautiful lute with a little bit of chiaroscuro shadowing here. We have an elaborate tablecloth. We have a little bit of a landscape in the background. We have architectural elements. We have a globe. Now, remember, the Dutch were great traders and explorers, and so globes were really, globes and maps were loved by the Dutch. And think about in some of Vermeer's paintings, we see these elaborate globes and maps. And then we have a peak of landscape here and these falcons. And then we have like Mars at the top of this beautiful container. And we have it almost as cantilevered. It looks like it's going to tip at any moment. But what does it suggest? It suggests that this family was upper bourgeois, and the Flemish tended to be a little more elaborate in their still lives. The Dutch a little more simplistic, and you'll see that and why I'm saying that in just a minute. So this is very asymmetrical. He's got this kind of pyramidal formation, and he was obviously influenced by Caravaggio. All right, so we're going to move on. And okay, another work by Jan Davids de Heem is this still life with lobster. Now, everybody probably has heard the story that lobster, until much more recently, lobster was sort of considered not a particularly lavish seafood to eat. I mean, now it's very expensive. I love lobster. People covet lobster. But at the time, I'm not sure how they evaluated, but obviously it took, it had a presence, because here, this beautiful lobster in this sumptuous Pronkstilleven. So here we have a nautilus shell, because again, as I mentioned, they're on the North Sea in Amsterdam. and Antwerp are both on the sea. So you have an interest in sea objects, a nautilus shell. We have the beautiful lobster. You can even see the little eye with the little crust on his skull. I mentioned that citrus showed exotic quality and also wealth because they usually came from warmer countries like Spain and North Africa. And so that means that these people were acquiring them from other places. What does the box tell us? Well, in this mouth-watering display, we have this beautiful box. Is it unlocking secrets? Does it look beyond the spiritual realm to be unlocked? So it's not quite sure why he incorporated this, but we can sort of only guess. It's a beautiful textured box. We see this roamer, which is at the top of the box. And what is a roamer? A roamer is a glass that is used for alcoholic consumptions because the glass tends to be rather big. And you think about it, you have a glass or two of wine to lift another big glass, it could shatter. So they put these embellishments or ledges on the glasses, and you can see it here. I don't know if my pointer is working, but you can see this here. And then we have all manner of vegetation. The light falls on the grapes, the silver, you can see reflection. Oysters, what does oyster represent? Sensuality. So these artists were really wanted to sort of unlock mysteries of life, and they do it with this just sumptuous display of wealth and beauty. All right, probably one of my favorite still life artists is the great George Flegel. Now, there's not a lot written about him. I actually one day was at a museum book sale and I picked up this German book because I saw this on the cover and I went, oh my God, I don't even know who this artist is. I want to investigate it. And so George Flegel, he was born in Moravia and he was an early German still life painter. He was probably the greatest early still life painter from Germany. But he did work with Flemish and Dutch painters too. He worked for a time in Vienna. He worked for a great Flemish painter there. And then he moved to Frankfurt. So he did move around. He established a studio and he focused his life on still life painting. He did go to Utrecht for a while. He was a member of the St. Luke's Guild, which many of these artists were. But, he was a Catholic, and the Catholic Flemish and German painters tended to be a little more moralizing in a religious context. So you can say in a memento mori, like a skull, that is in general death and ephemeral nature of life. But here he starts to do very specific religious things, like these cherries represent the passion, red currants and cherries, currants here, cherries here. The bread and the wine are the Eucharist. And then we have cheese, fromage, that will represent longevity. So the bread and the wine, the Eucharist, the passion with the cherries, and then the dragonfly. So, of course, we have talked about the dragonfly, the present moment, a fleeting moment, but look how beautiful. You can almost see sort of the translucent quality of the rings, the translucent quality to this glass of wine, these beautiful almonds. The perspective is rather unusual. The coloration is, to me, rather exquisite. So it references divine creation. So it's more heavily, it's not negative like some of the vanitas that we're going to see in just a moment. But it's more of a beautiful religious nature. So in the beginning, we started with this painting, which is one of my favorites. It's so elaborate. Still life with a parrot. So parrots, why is a parrot in a still life painting? First of all, doesn't this look like a beautiful pastry shop? Maybe you'd go and see in France or Europe, just, oh, beautiful little, petit fours and macaroons and things like that. So we have such hyper detailed objects. But in this case, as different from the painting we just looked at, this isn't overly religious. It's more about plenty and bounty. Okay, so I talked to you a little bit about the parrot. What does the parrot represent? Well, the Dutch and Northern European artists, they love these birds, and also it shows exotic qualities of travel. brought back from a warmer climate. So that's what it shows. It also shows the wealth of this person. This is a wealthy home. Look at the little gorgeous Mars in gold on top of the canopy here. We have something that's really interesting to me are these faces. They're called mascarons, Mascarons. Mascarons were bas-relief sculptural embellishments on this falcon. So it's beautifully done. And of course, this Dutch inspired or Flemish inspired arrangement of flowers, absolutely exquisite. But look how his perspective is so unique. And then again, this use of chiaroscuro, the reflections in the pewter top, the little seashells gathered, the figs and nuts and butterflies and knife, which is sort of cantilevered on this table. Now, it's funny because the table at the bottom is pretty basic, but then we see a beautiful lace tablecloth to hold some of the other objects. So this beautiful George Flegel. Now, Carl Fabritius was a student of Rembrandt, and he was living in Delft and Amsterdam. And he was born, I'm not sure if he was born in Delft, but he did study in Amsterdam with Rembrandt, and then he spent most of his career in Delft. Tragically, he died at 31 or 32 to be precise, with an explosion in a Delft magazine factory. Magazines where guns and gunpowder was stored. There was an explosion. He died. His parish priest, not priest, he was a minister, died along with him. Literally like a quarter of the whole city of Delft was affected by this explosion. Many people died. Many buildings were destroyed. He was such a brilliant artist. He was also part of the St. Luke's Guild. He was such a brilliant artist that of all the students of Rembrandt, and many famous ones, he was considered the most skilled because even though he took a lot from Rembrandt, the use of light, for example, and detail, he didn't use a lot of Rembrandt's, he didn't copy Rembrandt. He did cultivated his own ideas. And the use of a very light background was very unlike Rembrandt. If you look at a lot of Rembrandt's, our very own beautiful St. Bartholomew in the Timken, there's a very dark monochromatic. Well, this is monochromatic too, but he really shows trompe l'oeil, fool the eye. So he fools the eye. You almost feel like you could touch the little bird, the little goldfinch. What was this painting used for? It was used probably to maybe even a cover of a cage, but we have all these really detailed feathers, but it's softer. You can almost feel the downy feathers. And the little bird is chained to his bird feeder. So he was a very prominent painter. Vermeer loved his pristine lighting and composed tranquility. So a very tragic figure. All right. So William van Als, we'll just talk about him briefly. He was Dutch. He grew up in Delft. Father was a city notary, so he joined the guild. He was very talented. Worked in Florence. He worked for the Medicis. They loved this kind of Pronkstilleven, this profusion of flowers. Rachel Reich, which you're going to see in just a minute, was a student of his. But look at this exquisite flower arrangement. The light as it falls on the petals of the flower. Now, what is the symbolism of the watch? Well, because, we say it's sort of a memento mori, life is passing by, but he uses it very carefully. Well, we have this blue ribbon, which is a nice sort of primary color with the yellow, red, and blue. So he puts those primary colors together, gives it a lot of depth. The light, you've got the dragonfly with its translucent rings, the gorgeous marble table, exquisite light and detail, and then, of course, a little mouse. Believe it or not, the mouse kind of represents abundance. So you might think of, ew, vermin, how disgusting. Okay, so we do really want to talk about this painting by the great Haarlem artist Pieter Claesz. So Pieter Claesz and William Claesz Heda were super important still life painters in the city of Haarlem. And also, I just want to make a little mention of Jacob van Ruysdael, who was also a Haarlem painter around this time, and he was known for a little bit later, but he was known for his incredible landscapes. We have a beautiful Van Rijssel and the Timken, and it's in on the same wall in our marvelous Dutch and Flemish gallery. So please come and visit because it's just a really treat. So he was an important Dutch painter. He was born in Berchem, but he immigrated into Haarlem. He shows influence of many artists like Osias Bert, as I mentioned. He loved to show food and drink. Okay, so he did what are called ontbijts, and I don't pronounce it very well. It's a Dutch word, but it means breakfast scenes. This Timken painting is actually both a breakfast scene and a smoker's requisite. There are smoker's implements here, a half-consumed glass of beer, which would have indicated, excuse me, something a person would eat for breakfast, as was the fish. But the smoker's requisites would obviously be the brazier where they burned, got a light for the tapers. We have a little tobacco box here. We have an overturned earthenware jug with a pewter top with a reflection. Look at the light as it falls on this beautiful Venetian glass. And then the fish is cantilevered. This is not overtly moralizing, but it does have memento mori. Fish, dead. Beer glass, half consumed. Embers, dying. So he does bring up that it's very subtle symbolic reference. Now, one other thing I want to say about this painting, and I'm rushing a little bit because there's so much more to see, is that after 1645, 1650, many of Claesz's paintings became more elaborate. Why? Because more goods were being passed back as these boats were bringing in, these ships were bringing in marvelous objects of commerce. So we begin to see more elaborate things, but you don't see it here. Okay, so this is the typical vanitas with memento mori. It's a snuffed out candle, an empty glass, a watch, and a skull, all done in a very monochromatic palette, which he was known for. Grays, greens, there's a little bit of a blue ribbon on the stopwatch, but an overturned glass. Remember, you have to have temperance if you want to live a long life. A skull, momentum of death. And one other thing is books. Now, some people used to say that books would indicate, how do I say, kind of indulgence. You know, I always think as I'm getting older, I want to learn more and more. But some people thought, oh, you're trying too hard. Not me personally, but the Dutch thought, you know, you're sort of showing off, you know, trying to learn too much. So they looked at books as, in a way, sort of in a moralizing capacity as well. So Clara Peters was not a lot was known about her, but they don't even know when she died. She did marry late. She was baptized in Antwerp. She was a Flemish painter. She married very light. She joined the Antwerp Painters Guild. Very talented, very trained early, shown to be just a master. She was a student of Osias Bert, and she produced a marvelous collection of work. So I'm a little bit short on time. I'm going to go quickly to the painting of Still Life with Fish. Now look at the warm tonalities. Look at the depth of this painting. The incredible little cat as he clutches the fish. But there are some religious aspects in the painting. The way that the fish is placed in the colander indicates a crucifixion. She was Catholic. And also the fish indicate the brethren of Christ. So they were the, you know, the converts, the brethren of Christ, the fish. His symbol is a fish, and so it has a religious reference. But look at the beautiful tonalities, the underbelly of the fish, its blind eye. And she adds a lot of interest by having this eel's body curve, the curvilinear aspect that is duplicated in the form of the colander. So, and you can see some of it peeking out. It's sort of gruesome to me, but look again, it's sort of a limited palette, but she creates so much depth and light with it. All right, another female artist I want to talk about just for a moment is Giovanna Garazzone. And Giovanna Garazzone was really known for her observations in botanical drawings. She researched botanical and scientific discoveries. Her brushstroke is much looser, much different. You don't see that really detailed, hyper tight brushstroke. She likes that sort of nature suspended, which the Italians were known for. Her paintings were very fashionable among the wealthy, and they were prized. The Medicis loved to decorate their villas with her work. So here we have these robust citrons and little, probably limes, and you see the flowers blooming. It is not a moralizing painting. It's just more, you see a little fly, but it just indicates what she's interested in. This is probably brought from a garden. As the Italians were wont to do, it's kind of chipped. It's not hyper detailed, hyper refined, but shows more of a, excuse me, a stylistic concern brought about by the Italians. So probably one of the most gifted painters at this time was Willem Kalf. And he was born in 1619. He was baptized in Rotterdam. One of the best still life paintings of the 17th century. He lived in Paris for 8 years, returned to Rotterdam, did very well, but he loved these very refined objects. This is Pronkstilleven because these objects are so expensive. We have Wan Lien, this porcelain, gorgeous porcelain cup or vase. We have a nautilus shell. And what the Dutch like to do, and the Flemish painters, they put nautilus shells, a shell, and then they would put a beautiful decorative top. So what we have here is Atlas, probably holding up the nautilus shell. We have the tipped over top and the exquisitely peeled citrus. Again, shows a wealthier person. And then the bas relief of these objects and silver, and then the light source. It's just really quite remarkable, very exotic. It's sort of a parade of possessions. And in Holland and Belgium, the middle class, particularly in Belgium, Holland, excuse me, like to decorate their small homes with these beautiful paintings. So Rachel Reich was one of the most remarkable female painters of this time. She represents a second generation of still life painters. And her maternal grandfather was really important. He was an architect. Her father was a scientist. So she learned how to study great works of art. And this is such an elaborate, it's just layers of flowers. It celebrates color and texture and light as it falls on the objects and the variegated leaves. And we have the light sources here. We have something like a window or a painting in the background. We have little butterflies and maybe even a little moth and the warm tonalities, but as the light source, this chiaroscuro falls on the flowers. It's just a really beautiful pyramidal shape. I apologize, I'm going through a little more quickly because we really have to talk about the Spanish in the last 5 minutes. Okay, Adrian Court, the second generation still life painter. Not a lot is known about him. He was a Dutch painter, did lovely small interpretations of vegetables and fruit, flowers. He was kind of rediscovered much later, and I just think his work is just marvelous. They're minimalist, they're very deeply calibrated. Now he's incorporating the light source, what is called tenebrism. It's different than chiaroscuro because mostly it's used for contrast and to highlight, whereas chiaroscuro is more helps to show three-dimensionality. So this tenebrism is just remarkable. And look at how the twine is so beautifully detailed, and you see his signature and this sort of dead asparagus, but take a look, Adrian Court, because really just incredible artist. Now, I've got to spend a few minutes on these marvelous Spanish painters. Francisco de Zurbarán was the Caravaggio of Spain during the Baroque era, and he was known for his religious paintings. He depicted a lot of saints and also monks. For example, we have a beautiful painting of a Franciscan monk in the Timken, and they have one at the SDMA. So he did monks and people of religious orders. He was appointed painter of Philip IV in Spain, lived in Sevilla. He did meet Caravaggio, they think, not 100% sure. He does use tenebrism. His later work was inspired. His later work was inspired by Titian, but also he was inspired by Cotin, the artist I'm going to show you in just a minute. This is, one other thing I want to show you. He was such a marvelous painter that Philip said, "You are the painter for kings, but you are the king of painters." So here we have a beautiful, just still life with pots. And if you know the Italian painter Morandi, you will think about maybe he looked at these because Morandi, the Italian metaphysical painter, was so inspired by hyper detail of objects. So we see each object, the silver, the detail, this tenebrism, this light source, really remarkable. Now, Peter Steldahl, one of the greatest critics, he worked at the New Yorker, he died a couple years ago, he's one of my heroes. He looked at this painting and he wrote an article in the New Yorker about 5 years ago, prior to his death, and he said, in all of art history, I have to say that this is probably the most beautiful still life ever created. And to me, my way of thinking, I have to agree. Why is this so beautiful? It's like an altar. It's like we're looking into the religious space, infinity. And what does it represent? It's really an homage to Mary. It's an extraordinary painting. The oranges and the water and the oranges, the rose, it represents Mary, the Virgin Mary. We have a cup of water, her purity, the thorns, her the Immaculate Conception. There's so much rhythm and light. Look at this beautiful altar, woven baskets, so detailed. You know, Zurbarán's son was a great still life painter. Unfortunately, he died young, although he did produce some magnificent works. Visit this at the Norton Simon. I've talked about this painting many times, and I will tell you, I make an homage every year to see this painting because I love it so much. All right, we're going to go on, and for some reason, okay. So Juan Sanchez Coton was a marvelous sort of a predecessor to Zurbarán. He too worked for the courts. He worked in Toledo, but eventually he became, not so much for the courts, I'm sorry, more for the Catholic orders, but eventually he became a Carthusian. And the last part of his career, he actually became a monk, and so a Carthusian monk. This is a remarkable work because it represents his best painting. Because to be honest with you, many people feel that his religious paintings, although this is religious in some degree, his figurative paintings were not as successful. This is a successful painting. Why are these objects hanging? Because in Spain, without refrigeration, you want to keep the vermin off the fruits and vegetables, so they hung them in a sill. What else does it talk about? Well, it talks about celestial navigation, because in 1609, I mentioned Galileo directs his telescope to the night sky, but don't think that even though this is 7 years before, that they weren't studying celestial navigation, because of Spanish at this time were great explorers. So they were always interested in the night sky. So that represents the studies of the night sky. And also he catered to, before he went into a monastery, a very intellectual class of people. This represents Archimedes' hyperbola, which relates to geometric study and circles. And you can see that with the carved melon. Lastly, I'll say that this inky space, this altarpiece, it's like a window into another world. So very, very beautiful. I made a little bit of a mistake in that I should have included this with Zurbarán, but this is in the SDMA, San Diego Museum of Art, as is this painting. So they're not on view now. They're actually traveling for a year or two. I'm not sure how long. I know at least a year. And so that you would have been able to see this in the past. Right now it's traveling. So this is a beautiful Agnus Dei. Agnus Dei is a reference to the crucifixion of Jesus. It's an innocent lamb tied in preparation for sacrifice. So it represents the body of Christ and the Gospel of John. So it's a little different than a still life that we've been looking like flowers and fruit, but it does represent that genre. All right, we have the last painting, and we're just about to make it right on time, so I'm happy about that. Okay, so Bartolomeo Bimbi was, again, not a ton is known about him. He studied in Rome and with a man named Mario di Fiore, which is interesting because that means flowers. And also he was employed by the Medici court. So he loved to paint their bounty, their fruits and flowers that were gathered in their gardens. They really supported some of the scientific study, botanical study of fruits and flowers. And so he had a long career of painting still lifes. What's so interesting about this one is it represents the gathering of pears in the Medici gardens. Now, you might say, there's so many different variations. Look at the label down here. Well, I did a little investigation and I found that there's over 3,000 species of pear worldwide. So just, I want to leave you with that idea, but look at the variation of pear. So I'm very happy to say I did get through a little rush, but I did get through all the paintings that I did want to show you. Please feel free to answer questions. I do like a little dialogue. It's always really interesting. You have great questions, viewers, so feel free. So Catherine is available to take your questions or look for the questions. And Catherine, any that we might want to address?
Yeah, one of the questions in the chat is in your favorite Zurbarán lemon still life, how did they figure out it was something to do with the Virgin Mary?
Oh, that's a good question. But throughout history, different symbols, just like okay, for example, like a white lily has always been given the meaning of purity. And so these ideas of why, the thorn, immaculate conception, it's just that flowers were often associated with the Virgin Mary and water, purity. So we always think of her with purity, so water. And so I'm not sure like exactly when and where, but suffice to say that these symbols have been used and conceived for a very long period of time. You might have even seen them in illuminated manuscripts. But and as I mentioned earlier, sometimes some artists use them as different interpretations. Like some people would have looked at a mouse instead of saying plenty, they might have seen it as disease. So not every symbol is the exact same for each artist, but in a general category, for example, rose was often attributed to the Virgin Mary. In fact, we have a beautiful Sienese altarpiece in it's a center for a triptych, and a little rose is being offered by the baby Jesus to Mary. So the rose has always been pretty bit deep reminder of Mary. So I don't know if I answered the question, but I hope that gives you a little bit of better understanding of the idea. But yeah, it's a beautiful still life, and it does, represent so much about, it really is about Mary. Another question?
Yeah, the next one is, are the terms vanitas and memento mori synonymous?
Great question. Excellent question. So, vanitas is the category of painting that would show a memento mori. And it's kind of, they're sort of synonymous, but not exactly. They're synonymous in the way that memento mori were placed. I am going to go back because that question is such a good one. I want to address it with clarity. This painting is a vanitas. This object is a memento mori. So you would find these objects that reference death and dying and ephemeral nature in a kind of a vanitas. But that's a great question. Very good question. I hope I answered it correctly. I mean, correctly I did, but with this tipping glass. Any other questions? Catherine, were there any other questions that you
Yeah,
could see?
I don't see any more. So if there's no further questions, then thank you so much, Karen. That was an amazing talk. Um, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Yes, thank you all for joining us. And I just think looking at these paintings, it's rather uplifting. So I hope you feel the same. We'll see you next month. Take care, everybody. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.